All right, great. All right, thank you guys, everybody, for finding your way back from lunch and joining me. I imagine we'll have more people trickle in as time progresses, but my name is Clower, and today I'm going to be giving you a presentation on integrating junior developers into your team and making sure they're productive members of your society. So before we start about what we do want to have happen, what I want to emphasize is what we do not want. And what we do not want are red shirts. So we don't want people who, in their first foray into the developing world, just like really struggle with what we're trying to teach them, step on a rock and blow up, get overwhelmed by all the technical jargon, get phased by a blaster. We want people who, are really going to learn from us, get contributed members of the team, and eventually, maybe someday, they could be killed off dramatically in a season finale. So who am I? I already said my name is Clower, and my career path, unfortunately, I was a red shirt. I started as a high school math teacher, and on my first expedition down to the high school land, I was killed, brutally massacred by the students that were there. As a consequence, I decided to become a developer and became a junior developer. And eventually, after enough time and hard work, I became a productive team member. Currently, I'm an associate developer at Workstate Consulting, a consulting firm that's just right down the road at North Market. It's right in that area. Quite a cool place to work. We also have a booth next door. You should go say hi to the people that are at that booth afterwards. You can get a free little Lego like that. It's a squishy toy, but you can also connect them. Pretty great. At Workstate, I've worked with Drupal, I've worked with LifeRay, and currently I'm on site with Chemical Abstract Services working in a more DevOpsy role. So I started as a web developer, but I'm kind of broadening my bases. So what I'm going to be talking to you about? Well, for starters, we're going to be talking about how to onboard people with onboarding best practices. Next, set phase you're just done. Replicable technology setup. Then, I'm a doctor, not a teacher. We're going to be talking about effective technical teaching methods. And finally, we're going to teach you how to live long and prosper and how to really integrate these developers into your team and how to develop them further. So let's get started. All aboard the USS Enterprise with onboarding best practices. So the first thing that you want to do is have a good day one experience with your developers. The most important thing is to have a computer available for them. If you don't have a computer available, then that probably means they're going to be spending the entire day looking over somebody's shoulder. They're going to feel really awkward. You're wasting their time. You're wasting your money. None of that's good. This allows them on day one to be able to customize their computer preferences. On day one at my job at Workstate, they told me, hey, get rid of all the stuff that you have on Windows. You're switching over to Ubuntu. That was my first time with Linux, so that's what brought me here. Next, you need to plan a team meeting or a team lunch, preferably. If you have remote employees who like to work remote, but they're going to be on the team, try and bring them in that one day. Make sure that everybody is there and that this junior developer has time to mingle, to cooperate, and to communicate with the team members. If they feel like they know all the different people on their team, they're not going to feel bad about asking different people questions. And that's going to be one of the most important things for them to develop, is to be able to have a solid base of people that they can ask questions. Lunch is a great way to do that. If you can take them out to lunch, that's an excellent opportunity. If you can't, pizza's pretty cheap. Little Caesar's pretty cheap. Next up, you want to assign a buddy team member. So this is going to be somebody who's at the similar level as them. It's going to be somebody that they can ask the stupid questions. For instance, when I started working in Linux, I was like, what did he mean when he said cd up a directory? Just like completely different world to me. I didn't understand that type of thing. And if I was trying to talk to some senior level programmer, they'd look at me like I was stupid. Instead, I had a buddy who had been there for like a year longer than I had, and he could understand where I was coming from with these stupid questions. But you also want to make sure that they're going to be able to communicate with each other pretty well, so you're going to want to try and put them in the same general area. The communication barrier between having somebody all the way across the office who is your buddy and having somebody who is like 2 feet away, that's a huge difference. You're much more likely to bug somebody with the basic questions that you need to get started if they're right there, as opposed to having to go all the way across. Next, you want to keep it low stakes. So on day one, you just want them to feel relaxed. Get them to know the people, get them to know the type of environment that they'll be working on, but you don't want to overload them with, here's 50 billion things that you need to learn in order to do your job. Especially for junior developers, they're going to feel very overwhelmed. This is probably one of their first jobs since college, or coming out of college, so it's going to need to be a more welcoming, friendly environment. The HR site Paycor says that 58% of employees who are likely to stay at a company if they have a good onboarding program. So if you make sure that you're onboarding your employees well at the beginning, then they're going to be productive members of your team for a lot longer than somebody who you just kind of slapdash, okay, here's your stuff, go do whatever you need to do. But onboarding doesn't stop with the day one. It also continues into future weeks. So in weeks 1 through ongoing, your responsibility as a team member or as a team lead especially, 1, you want to make sure you're maintaining documentation on tools and how to install tools and everything like that. And that's a really big one because if you just say, hey, install Linux, install this IDE, install this, they're going to be very overwhelmed very quickly. Whereas if you give them a step-by-step guide, here are the things that you need in order to do your job, they're going to have a much better idea of what they need. And we'll actually be working on one of those in a little bit. Next, you need to have confidence-building mini deliverables. So if you just say, learn Git, that's not helpful at all. In fact, that's going to be very intimidating. They're going to be confused. If instead you said, at stand up tomorrow, I want you to give us 5 Git commands that you think are useful, then that's giving them a very specific timeline. It's giving them a very specific idea of what you expect from them, and they're going to be able to present that. When they present that to you, then you're going to be able to say, hey, those are really useful Git commands. Here are a couple more. Or, honestly, we don't use those ones that much. Instead, I would look in this direction. If you give them these type of mini deliverables, that'll help them feel a sense of accomplishment and actually achieving something definitive instead of just, I learned Git, it's I did this presentation, and it'll give you a good idea of where they are at as a developer. Check in on your buddy system on a regular basis. So make sure that your buddies are actually communicating with each other. If they're not, then there's some sort of breakdown. Maybe your new employee is too nervous about asking your buddy questions and you need to get them with somebody who's a little bit more chill. Maybe they don't get along at all. Just figure out if that thing is working. Next, you need to provide contacts within your organization so that they're not bugging the same person every single time. It's really draining as somebody to have somebody constantly asking you questions. And it's draining to be the person constantly asking questions. If you can ask like 5 different team members, hey, I had a question about Git, I'm going to ask you. Hey, I had a question about front-end development, I'm going to ask you. Then you feel like you're spreading out your questions more and you're more willing to communicate. Next, you want to communicate flexible but defined timelines. Most junior developers are going to be coming directly out of school. They're going to be used to their teachers saying, on Friday at 3 p.m., you have to have this assignment in my box, something like that. If you're giving them a flexible but defined timeline, say you need to install Ubuntu onto your machine in 2 days, and you're giving them that timeline, they know approximately how long you think it should take. They're going to work towards that timeline, and it's not just going to be this nebulous like, well, I feel like I did a lot at work today, but I didn't actually get it done. It's like, yeah, in 2 days I was able to install this. It's not all your responsibility, though, and a lot of it has to do with your junior developer. They have the responsibility to actually set up the technology. If you give them a really good document of how to go through your technology and set it up, if they're not following that document, then that's their problem. They need to also make sure that they're documenting pitfalls for future onboarding. So if they run into this problem in setup and they try and set it up multiple times and keep on running into this problem, they should probably be writing that down in the onboarding document. Say, hey, if you get this error, it's because you don't have the right permissions on this directory. And they can write down, here's the way to change their permissions. If they're writing this, then that gives you a good idea of where they're at, and it also helps onboard future people. If you give them mini projects that they need to do, then they also need to deliver on those. It could be something like have a Linux distribution up and running, and they give you the distribution. They say, hey, look, I got all of this up and running. That could be a mini project, but they actually need to do that. They need to rely on their buddy. Hey, I accidentally deleted the entire Git repo. Okay, did you delete the entire Git repo or did you delete your entire Git repo? 2 very different things. Have a buddy that they can talk to for stupid things like that. They need to talk to the variety of sources that you're cultivating. Don't just ask the same person the same questions. And lastly, they need to meet deadlines or at least communicate why they're not going to be able to meet deadlines. So let's say it takes them a lot longer than they expected to set up this Linux server or their Linux laptop. Then if they just say at stand up 2 days later, yeah, I haven't been able to do that, then that's a big red warning beacon. If instead they queued you in with the entire process, said, hey, I'm really struggling getting this onto a flash drive, getting this boot up sequence started like a day and a half earlier, then you could give them that advice, that hint, how to do this. So if they're communicating with you, even if it takes them way longer than you expect for them to get stuff set up, as long as they're communicating why they're struggling, then that's going to be fine. You can work on the speed in the long run. If they're not communicating with you, you really need to work on that communication, opening those pipelines. So with a junior developer, structure is key. Like I said, most of these people are coming out directly from high school or college, and they're going to be coming from a very regimented structure. You need to be at this class at this time with these homework assignments completed. So you need to have this technical onboarding document that you can give them. Say, here's the structure for setting up your thing. This will help them help themselves, and just instead of just giving them a whole bunch of random Confluence pages, you can say, here's what you need, then that's great. You need to communicate your expectations clearly. And so I know a lot of can about blank, like a CSS precompiler. And they're going to be so confused by what you just asked that they're not going to have any sort of good idea of what it is exactly that you want. Or they'll be just learning this stuff but not have anywhere to show you that they've actually learned it. So if you communicate expectations clearly, like I talked about with the mini deliverables, then that's going to help a lot. And lastly, you want to set some goals. So some short-term goals might be something like get Linux up and running. A long-term goal, they could say something like, in a year, I want to feel like I understand how to use Git. And that's a really big deal. And if they look back on that goal in a year from now and they're like, wow, I really had that as a goal, like I didn't know what a bash command was, and now all of a sudden I do, like they're going to have a good feeling of accomplishment that they gained a lot of knowledge over the course of the year. They're not going to feel like imposters that have joined this industry. They're going to feel like they actually know what's going on. So now we're going to do a little activity. It's a self-reflection activity. So I want you to get out some paper or your phone or something, and we're going to, for 4 minutes, write down one positive and one negative onboarding experience that you've had. So like at my last company, they did a really good job of getting me with a buddy, but they also didn't do a great job with making sure that my expectations were set clearly. And lastly, one positive and one negative about your team's most recent onboarding. So the team that you are on, what's something that you did well while onboarding this person, and what's something that you did poorly? All right, so you got about 4 minutes. Go ahead and write this out. All right, there's a little bit of time left, but I trust that gave you some time to think. So go ahead and raise your hand for me. Raise your hand up. Okay, high five somebody nearby you. Nearish by. They don't have to be right next to you. That's going to be your partner. I want you to talk through some of these things that you talked about. So some of the things that you wrote down, actually communicate. What were some things that you did well? What are some things that you could do better? All right, go ahead and talk for a little bit.
use an Android device, those are communicate or modifying Wi-Fi system. The people we get are anywhere from 16 to 18 years old. Education, you don't know how long they've been educated, and we don't many projects and many institutions. We don't get very organized. Giving them many little tasks they can do. Throw the whole lump sum at them first. Good idea. What we're going to do. I think we start Harvard. He eventually got everything set up and never did the internet. That was once Linux was huge. We had 250 workers and we got together and tried to and we pretty probably about a month and a half. We got together got there faster. That's why we went to all this stuff in Linux. You work time.
All right, I realize there's still a lot of really good conversation going on, but for the sake of time, we're going to move on. All right, so let's get started moving on a little bit. I hope that you'll be able to take some of the experiences that the people that you talk to had and really apply them to your workplace. If somebody only had bad experiences, maybe that you shall help share your positive experiences with them so that they had a better idea. Or maybe somebody said that they actually didn't like structure, but trying to figure out a way that you could communicate structure without seeming overly structured. Like if you're at a startup and you vibe off of that no structure type thing, try and communicate like, hey, you still have to do your job. All right, so yeah, it's hard, I know. Next, we're going to talk about how to set your phasers to stun. So how to actually set up your technology. And so that last activity was the only one where you have to talk to people, but it's not our last activity. Instead, we're going to do what tech your junior developer needs. So for this activity, on that same piece of paper and an email draft or in a note app, go ahead and write down all the tech, the hardware, the software, languages that you use on a daily basis. Think through your entire day from starting at work till the end of the day. Include your version number if it's important. Like if it works on PHP 7 but not on 7.2, make sure you're writing that down. So go ahead and write that down for about 2 minutes. This list could be massive, by the way. Yeah, so don't feel bad if you don't get all of it, but make an honest attempt to try and get as much as you can.
Cool ringtone. Please keep it playing.
I almost looked that up just a few seconds ago.
I'm also throwing some suggestions on the screen that might kickstart your brain.
This is actually just to kind of pin test this and gather information about what version of we're all in.
Need to make sure you're off of Python 2. Two small little months.
I actually put 2+ because I don't think we do enough with Python for it to matter very much.
That pains some people in the room, I guarantee you. They're dying. Okay, again, I know you're probably still working on your list, but we're going to move on a little bit. Next to all of these, I want you to assess what technology you use, and I want you to categorize it. So categorize it as either not important, which would be an NI. So this is something that either they don't need at the first couple months, or it's just something that you use that's honestly not that important. I is either installed, so it's something that they can install and forget about it. For me, that might be like an Apache server. It was really easy to install and then completely forget about it. I didn't need to know the inner workings. Or it's intuitive, so something like Slack or Chrome, you're not going to need to teach them how to use it. And then U should be things that you actually need to understand in order to know how to use it. So something like knowing how to run bash commands. That's something you need to understand in order to run it, or at least you need to know the bash commands. These are things that you'll probably need to teach. So go ahead and write those letters next to all of the different technologies that you wrote on your list.
What was the letter for like just something you use? That's
Not important.
NI.
NI, not important. So here's my list again, and I've sorted it by not important, then U for understand. So you can see that there's about a column of not important stuff. This is something that I wouldn't have a junior developer install or a new member of my team install when they join me. At the time, I was working a lot on accessibility, so I had some accessibility things or some AMP validators. You probably don't need that if you're just starting out. I are the things that are relatively intuitive, like you might not know SQL commands, but honestly, in my job, all I had to do was run one database command at the very beginning, and that was it. It just fired off the database. U, you'll notice, is half of my column. So like a lot of stuff that they have to understand. So what I want you to do as homework is try and make your list a living document. This could be a Confluence page that you have in your organization or a Google Doc. I want you to share it with your team members via your team drive or Confluence and ask them to add all the stuff that they use on a regular basis. Try and get a good list of everything that your team uses, and so that way you have a good idea, A, of what everything uses, and B, when you start with a new employee, you can just say, here are the really important things that you need to install at the beginning. Here are the less important ones that are going to be useful in the long run. I want you to organize them based off of logical steps. It doesn't make sense for somebody to try and install their IDE before their distro. Then add time estimates next to all of these. And junior developers are coming from a background where they honestly don't know that much. So go ahead and multiply your time estimate by like 4, 5, 6 times what you think it should be. And that seems like a lot, but if it takes you 2 hours to set up a new distribution of Linux, it might take them like 3, 4 days, honestly. It could be that extreme, just because they're not used to this at all. If you can, find helpful resources that you always go back to. There are lots of good resources out there that are available, so write in those resources and add in hyperlinks to like, here's Confluence's page on how to use Git. It's super helpful. And finally, share this anytime you have a new developer. Make sure you're giving this as one of your onboarding documents. Here are all the things that you need to do in order to have your job effective. And you can assign them cards or assign them tasks based off of the order of importance that you decided on. So that's actually your homework. If you have to set an alarm or something like that on your phone so that you actually do it, the time that you spend making this and actually doing this homework is going to save hours and hours and hours of questions and your life when you hire on a new developer, even not a junior developer, just a developer. It's going to make it a lot easier to get new people onboarded to your team and make them effective a lot quicker. All right. So next up, I'm a doctor, not a teacher. So I come from a teaching background. I'm used to teaching, and I know a lot of software developers, unfortunately, aren't. So we're going to talk about some technical teaching methods and some way that you can teach effectively. So for starters, you want to bring some backward design to the forefront of your lesson planning, and you want to make sure you're differentiating for all the developers. You want to make sure you're scaffolding to help build their confidence, and you also want to keep Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences in mind. Okay? I'm just kidding. Especially in coding, vocab and jargon matter. Coding is like a foreign language. If you take somebody from China and you move them here and then you say, hey, why don't you know the word for water bottle? You're not going to act like they're an idiot for not knowing that word. They're not used to your language. They're not used to your environment. When somebody joins our organization, our coding organization, and they're somebody who has never learned to code or they're just starting off in their coding, you're going to be speaking literally a foreign language to them if you say something like cd up a directory or go ahead and nano that or buy that. They're not going to know, cat that thing and go over here. They're not going to understand what you're talking about. So you need to make sure that you're slimming down your vocab and you're making it understandable. Meet your junior developer where they are, and the best way to know where they are is to keep this idea in mind. I like to call it the tree model of learning. So your roots of the tree are things that everybody should know. Things like, well, everything at least that you're hiring somebody should know. How to turn on a computer, how to read. These are things that you should not need to check with them that they know how to do that. If they don't know how to turn on a computer, probably shouldn't have hired them. You need to talk to your HR. The trunk is where they need to have a solid base of knowledge. So in order to know how to do a templating engine, they really need to understand HTML. In order to know how to use a SAS precompiler, they need to know how to use CSS. In order to know how to use a PHP framework, they need to know PHP. This trunk is going to be the foundation of all their knowledge, and if they don't have a really strong, solid trunk, they're not going to be able to do anything. The branches are the more specific knowledge, so things like SAS or Drupal if they're using PHP, or Liferay for Java if you're a front-end developer. And then the twigs are the really nitty-gritty thing. They might know how to write a pseudocode for loop because they learned that in Programming 101, but they don't know how to do that in your specific language. So the twigs are like the syntax, the things that you would have to look up in a dictionary if you were trying to learn your foreign language. The leaves are the visual demonstration of the skill, and this could be something like actually having a committed code, or finally producing a website, something that has a usable end product that people can see. And you can't have leaves without a solid trunk. You can't have a usable end product if they don't know what their base is. So instead of trying to say, hey, give me this website, or why haven't you finished this, this merge request yet, you need to work backwards and say, like, what core elements of your tree are you missing out on? And it's not just me kind of making up some stuff in trees. You actually see this all over the place, even if you don't recognize it in video games. You got skill trees all over the place. Borderlands, Spider-Man, God of War, like any video game basically that you play, you need to learn how to shoot your web in order to learn how to swing through Manhattan at 40 miles an hour. You need to learn how to punch a guy before you can punch 20 guys. You need to think of your development in terms of this tree. What are the elements that they need to know before progressing on to the next level? So you need to assess your junior developer's baseline. And the way you do this is by asking questions. When you're teaching, about 90% of your teaching should be asking questions. And these should start with broader questions. So like, okay, can you explain to me what Git is? And they kind of stumble through an answer and it's very obvious that they don't have any clue. Then you can really dive in there. Whereas if they give you a pretty detailed answer, then you can really work with those details and then start asking them narrower and narrower questions to really judge exactly where it is they're at. You want to start with these open-ended but leading questions. So instead of just saying like, how would you write this function? You might say, how would you write a for loop to solve this function? That's going to give them an idea of what you would expect for them to do, but it's also going to give them enough direction that they'll be able to actually think about it. So it's a lot easier to come up with the solution if you already have a solid baseline as opposed to just a very nebulous baseline. They're also going to ask you a lot of questions. So the number one thing you need to do is when you're thinking about a new technology, you need to prepare for the common questions that they're going to have. Because if they come to you with the same question over and over, then that probably means you're not giving them a good explanation. If you're instead thinking about the questions that they might have and preparing a quick answer, then that's probably going to be a lot more beneficial in the long run. I know there are some people, myself included, who they get a question on Slack and they immediately want to fire off an answer. Whereas if you think about it for a little bit, you might realize that your junior developer is not actually asking that specific question. They're asking something a little bit more broad. And if you prepare an answer for that that includes the solution to the question that they asked, they're really going to appreciate that. But at the same time, you want to avoid tangents. Nobody needs to know a history lesson, know who Linus is, in order to get started with their new distribution. Don't give them an hour-long answer to a 5-minute-long question. Don't talk down to them. And this is a really hard one because honestly, we're so used to thinking in our foreign language that it's hard to put yourself back into their shoes. But the best way to not talk down to them is by asking them questions, allowing them to explain what they already know, and then continuing to ask them questions. And that goes directly in with asking questions back. You want to check in with them when you're giving an explanation. Check in with them often. So like give them like a 2-minute long explanation and say, okay, so can you summarize what it is that I just said? That might seem slightly condescending, but it's also very easy for them to be able to say what it is approximately you said and for you to gauge whether or not that you understood it. If they honestly have no clue how to start summarizing what it is you just said, then they didn't understand anything. And so even though you spent 2 minutes teaching them, that was worthless time. So if you're checking in, it's a lot better to spend 2 minutes giving them worthless information than an hour. So make sure you're checking in with that often. And lastly, there are no stupid questions. So don't get me wrong, junior developers are going to ask a lot of stupid questions. But it could be a stupid question like asking a foreign person, hey, how do you say in your language the little thing, it like barks? They're like, a dog? Yeah, a dog, of course. It's not a stupid question. You're learning a new language, okay? Speaking of dogs, there's my puppy. All right, next we're going to teach you how to live long and prosper and how to really integrate your junior developers into your team and how to develop them. For starters, you need to become a better team member. And you could be a great team member. You can probably still improve. You need to lose the 2-mile uphill both ways mentality. So like back in my day, it was really hard to get this distribution started, or I didn't understand what I was doing for Git until I accidentally deleted an entire repository. If instead you're giving them the instruction as they go, that's going to speed up their learning process significantly. Sure, they can make some mistakes, but if you're making sure that they have a good understanding of what's happening, that's going to be a lot better for them in the long run, and it's going to be a lot better for your team in the long run. You need to help prepare resources, and your homework that you have is really useful for that. Preparing this technical onboarding document so that they have a good idea of how to get started. Find somewhere that explains hard topics well, especially Git. For junior developers, it's just mystical. You need to be patient with them. It honestly will take them a lot of time to do things that you think should be done very quickly. But you have to keep in mind, they're coming at this from a completely new perspective. If you're giving them the time, and as long as they're actively working on them, then they're going to become useful very shortly. I came into this field a year and a half not knowing anything about anything, and now I feel like I'm kind of useful. And lastly, stand up for your people. I come from a consulting firm, and so we work with some of our clients. And our client might be like, hey, why is this junior developer taking so long to do this? And they don't know the whole background of your thing. If you say, okay, well, we're going to work with them. We're going to swarm on that card, make sure that we get it done. You're not throwing them under the bus and say, hey, they're just worthless. They don't know what they're doing. You need to make sure that you're standing up for them, so that way they feel comfortable around you as a team. You're also wanting to avoid typical junior developer pitfalls. So a pitfall might be their real weaknesses that they never really talk to you about. So in your interview, you're used to asking somebody like, hey, what are your weaknesses? And they might respond with like, I really try too hard, or I spend too much time communicating with my team. That's not real. After they've been working with you for a month or two, ask them about their real weaknesses. Like, hey, are you a bad procrastinator? If they are a bad procrastinator, they'll probably tell you, maybe tomorrow. But they'll tell you, and then you know, okay, this person's a procrastinator. I need to give them concrete deadlines. They need to be done with this task by Tuesday at 4 p.m. And if they have that deadline in their mind, that prevents all procrastination. And if you set that firm deadline, they're going to be like, I need to do this now. It might not be great at that time, but hey, it'll be done. And then from there, you can really work with them on improving it. Whereas if you just say, hey, get this done, they're going to procrastinate, and you're never going to see an end product. Another one that they might have is discomfort asking questions. A lot of people come with an imposter syndrome mindset. So they feel like, I don't belong in this industry. I honestly don't know what I'm doing here. Why did they hire me? They're paying me a lot of money. And part of that manifestation is going to be they're not going to want to ask the stupid questions. So if you really sit down with them and they say, hey, I've just been having a hard time talking to people about these type of questions. That's why my tasks have been taking so long, because I try and Google everything. Then you need to work with them and give them more constant feedback. Maybe like every hour, swing by their desk and say like, hey, what's going on? Do you have any problems? Another one is they can't handle pressure, so this goes along with it. They might feel overwhelmed by the amount of work that you've given them, and they kind of shut down. They get on Reddit for 2 minutes, and that happens to be 2 hours, and then they're 2 hours behind where they were before they were overwhelmed, and that just kind of snowballs. If you're checking in with them and making sure they really understand what it is they're doing, then that's going to help them. There might be more weaknesses. So by finding out their weaknesses, you're really going to understand where they're coming from and what you can do to improve them and make sure that they're more productive on your team. Next, you want to overcome their over-reliance on the internet. So a lot of people automatically just Google a problem, they Google an error code, then they copy and paste from Stack Overflow into the code. Have them like write down in comments, I know comments aren't great, but write down in comments what it is each step along the way a function is doing. And if they don't know, then they'll try and figure out what it is it's doing, and they realize, oh, I could probably delete that step. I don't need that. If they're just copying and pasting things all the time, make sure they're really talking you through what it is all the functions are doing. So that way you don't end up with 30 extra libraries that you don't need. And lastly, you need to provide those specific expectations and arrangements. That's going to help a lot. I've talked about that a lot. That's probably my most the thing that I can stress the most is provide them specific. You need to have this thing done by now. And Jira cards, writing down really good acceptance criteria is one way of doing that. Working in Scrum, saying, hey, I expect you to have this done by the end of the sprint. That's a really good way of doing that. Code review is also probably one of the most effective ways that you can teach. And so the goal in code review for a junior developer shouldn't be to merge their code and to have it be good. It should be to merge their good code. So their first PRs are probably going to look like crap. They're probably going to like accidentally have deleted some files. They're not going to know what they're talking about. They're going to have like 30 extra functions that they don't need. So overall, the review should follow the similar tree model that we were talking about. It should start with the really broad concepts. What are the core elements that they're missing? Maybe they're adding in 20 files that they don't need. You need to talk to them about why they're adding in those files. If they can't explain it, then really hone those down. Then after those really big problems are fixed, try and look for smaller improvements. So maybe they got rid of all these libraries, but now like 1 or 2 things aren't working, work on those small improvements. And then the last one is refactoring, getting the syntax all in, getting the spacing correct. All of that stuff is very minor in the grand scheme of things, but the longer you hound them about it at the beginning of their career, the less bad code they're gonna have at the end of their career. So if you really work with a junior developer right when they start on getting all of their syntax and all of their Uncle Bob stuff perfectly done, then that's gonna be really good in the long run. You also, in code reviews, want to avoid personal attacks. And you shouldn't be doing this ever, but especially not with a junior developer. I have seen code reviews that they get pretty brutal in there, like, well, why would you do it this way? Or I've worked with one person that would just put a question mark as his code review comment. Like, question? And it's like, I don't know what that means. Does that mean he's angry at me? Does that mean I did it a really stupid way? Like, it's pretty personal, honestly. If you instead just give them constructive, helpful feedback, so why exactly did you call this function? What is this function doing? Then that's going to help them think about it. Comments should be constructive, and they should ask open-end questions. Give them an idea of what they can improve on, but have them answer you, so that way you can check their knowledge. And lastly, you need to be empathetic. It might have taken them like 2 days to write this PR that would have taken you like 30 minutes, but they're probably honestly proud of that PR. They're like, this might be one of my first PRs that I've ever made, and I worked really hard on getting everything right, and you're just gonna tear it apart? That's what your job is to do. You're supposed to do that, you want to do that, but at the same time, compliment them on the things that they did well. Say like, hey, you did a really good job commenting your code, or you did a good job making sure that it flowed in a logical fashion. If you're giving them that kind of feedback, as well as the negative feedback, that's gonna help a ton in the long run. Lastly, the summary. What you need to do is you need to prepare in advance. If a junior developer is going to join your team, you need to have your hardware ready, you need to have your onboarding materials ready, you need to have assignments for them, ideas of how to integrate them into your team quickly. You need to think of knowledge as a skill tree. Start with your solid trunk, work your ways out to the branches, and you can't have leaves without a good knowledge of all the stuff that comes below. You need to make sure that you're asking questions, checking in with them on a super regular basis. And you also need to make sure they're junior developers, they've never done this before. You need to make sure that you're being very patient with them. Does anybody have questions?
Any special recommendations for how this fits into a full remote work environment where you don't have any sort of office to bring people into?
Yeah, so the question is, if you don't have like a full office, if you're fully remote, how can you do this? Well, a good way is making sure that your communication channels are really clearly defined when they start the project. So like if you just say, hey, you can get me like via email or Slack or whatever, then they're gonna never really have a good idea of how to communicate with you. If you instead say like, hey, ping me through Slack anytime you need me, whenever you need me, just let me know and I'll answer, and then you make sure that you're keeping those channels open. If they ping you from Slack, make sure you're responsive. Even if you are in a meeting and you can't help out right that minute, say, yeah, I'm in a meeting, but I'll help you in an hour when I get out. Make sure you're keeping those channels open. Thankfully, I never did, but I've come very close to it. It wasn't, when I started with Git, I honestly had no clue what I was doing, and it didn't help that I was trying to use GitHub, which in my opinion is the worst of everything. So once I kind of really realized just the very basic analogy of what Git is doing, then I was like, okay. Thankfully, I'm probably never going to delete a repo.
Because you worked with them and tried to come with the answer, but you said, hey, I can't figure the answer, but they'll also teach you.
Yeah.
The answer.
That's a really good point, and a lot of times you want to do buddy coding with a new person, and a good point of buddy coding. It's not just to get things done quicker or to have multiple people thinking on the project. It's to get people up to speed with the project. So something that you could do is you can work with them and say, hey, you take the reins on trying to do this, and then you give them helpful feedback. Even if you don't know exactly how it is that you would do it, it's kind of good for both of you to figure it out, and it's also going to help to build that team chemistry. Yeah.
What do you do with problems beyond your skill set? Like it's in a problem that's never been tracked before, like a new branch mathematics are needed, or something like that. Like you hire them because of their advanced knowledge.
Yeah, so the question is, if somebody has really advanced knowledge that you don't really have, and how do you deal with that? Like, you can't really help them through their problems. Hopefully, a lot of the times, you honestly might be dealing with a junior developer who's like really good at math or really good at stat, but they haven't used this type of software. What you can try and do is give them as good a foundation as you can in the elements that you do know about. So give them a good understanding. If, let's say, they're really good at data analytics, but they're not really good at setting up their EC2 instance or something, that might be a completely different area of their expertise. The easier you can do, you just give them like a pipeline that they can just start up and then they can immediately start testing. That's one way that you can help out. So try and use what you know to help them. But I don't feel like that really answered your question. Yeah, Docker is another really good one. So let's say you don't want that huge startup time of them learning how to do all of this stuff. You just want them to be able to start working in the environment that they're comfortable with. You can set up a Docker image or something like that and just give that to them and say, hey, just run this. And this will take care of all that legwork, all the crappy stuff that you don't want to have to deal with. And just try and make it as convenient as possible for them to do the job that you hired them to do.
So coming at this from the perspective of a junior developer, a lot of the questions that, a lot of the things that you brought up that onboarding process should pay attention to, how much of that can you actually make it through a technical interview? Like a technical interview is meant to weed out a lot of those issues.
Yeah.
So how do companies actually decide, well, this is too many issues for us to actually teach them?
Yeah, so the question was, if you're in a technical interview, like you would expect to know a fair amount of this type of thing. At what point as a company do you decide this person probably doesn't have the knowledge? And what I would do instead of that is try and engage in the technical interview instead of asking them specifically about those type of problems. Because if they're applying as a junior developer, they're probably not going to know a lot of this stuff. Try and ask them about ways that they've overcome problems in the past. So it might not even be a coding thing, but tell me about a time that you were really faced with a struggle that you had to overcome, and that'll give you a good idea of like their work ethos and all of that type of thing, instead of asking them specifically about the technical thing. If somebody is a really hard worker and really quick at learning, it doesn't matter if they don't know a lot of the elements that you're going to be working on their job. In fact, I completely blew my technical interview. I maybe answered like one question correct, but they still hired me because I had a good enough reputation based off of my other credentials that I was a quick learner and I was able to understand things. And then in that case, as a junior developer, you really want to make sure that you're working towards that goal. Hey, they hired me expecting they'll be able to do this in the long run, so I'm going to make sure that I'm enforcing that. They're going to be grateful for you to giving them that opportunity. Most junior developers are going to come with a very limited skill set. So it is part of your client, and maybe if you need a project done in the next month and it has to be done right away, you shouldn't hire a junior developer, but investing your time in them at the beginning when there's a little bit more of a easy period in your work, then that would be a really good time to hire new junior developers. Yeah. Okay? Yes?
Kind of went along with the jargon stuff. Acronyms also changed between industries. So you may even have a seasoned person and you start using acronyms and they think it's one thing and it's something else. So I've got to tell you, if we use an acronym and then the follow line sounds strange, say stop and explain what the acronym is.
Yeah, and that's part of, so about acronym usage, it's really hard to gauge whether somebody understands what you're talking about if you don't check back in with them. So you're like, hey, do you know what I mean when I say blank, blank, blank? And they'll be like, oh yeah, you're talking about X. Then that's going to help a lot. So acronyms, there's a pretty famous Elon Musk email in which he like railed on all of SpaceX for using too many acronyms. He sent out like an email to the entire company like, hey, stop using acronyms, you idiots. Nobody can understand what you're saying when they join our company. So try and avoid acronyms as much as possible. Obviously, they're going to be useful a lot of the time. If you're using AWS, you have no choice but to use acronyms all the time. But at least make sure, one thing that I did as a junior developer is anything there was something that I didn't understand, I wrote it on a note card and posted it on right in front of my desk. So that way if somebody said like, what, or, oh, just fire up the EC2 instance, I could double check what it meant when they said EC2 instance. So giving them that knowledge of acronym base. Yeah.
You could also probably add that to the living document of what each acronym is.
Yeah, you could definitely add that to the living document. Hey, we're talking about these type of services all the time and we're going to use these acronyms, so here's a quick explanation. That's a really good idea. Yes?
How do you get the person to the interview to go into more depth about what they know to avoid having it just be to avoid having the interview being too narrow? Because let's say someone's an expert in Java and they actually are qualified through that on there, but you ask about someone's PHP and you end up making them never actually talk about anything they've actually done.
So he's saying if you're hiring somebody who's like really knowledgeable about Java, but they don't know much about PHP, how can you make sure that they're actually getting a chance to show you what they do know? And that's why a lot of technical onboarding procedures or technical interview questions are kind of language agnostic. So like, tell me about how you would do this, write some pseudocode about how you would do this element. And if you can understand what their thought process is, then it doesn't matter whether or not they've spent all their time in PHP versus Java or vice versa. You're going to know whether or not they kind of have the basic knowledge. Because once you learn one coding language, it's not a huge startup time to learn the others. It's just a matter of really putting in the time to learn the syntax. So give them the opportunity to actually flourish with what they know instead of penalizing them for the things that they don't know.
I'm talking more about they may know something more advanced in Java that you yourself aren't aware of as possible.
Oh, okay.
By having it be language agnostic, they may actually not realize to mention it.
Yeah, so if they know a lot more than you do during the interview, yeah, something that you didn't even think of, then honestly, that's probably a really good thing. It's showing that they have a good, solid base of knowledge. And if they're sharing that with you, then that probably means that it's going to be useful in the long run to bring them into your company so that they can share that type of knowledge with your company or with you specifically. So, yeah, so it looks like we're right about time, but if you come up here, I can continue this conversation with you. Everybody else, thank you so much for joining us, and I really appreciate you listening.